The BBC Micro, yes, that's BBC as in British Broadcasting Corporation. What were they doing in the computer business? Well, they weren't really. The machine was designed and built by another company, Acorn, working with the BBC as part of their National Computer Literacy Project. A rugged machine with a good keyboard and lots of expandability. One area where it really took off was education. These machines were more or less standard issue in British schools for a decade or more. It wasn't all about that though. This machine was big enough in the wider world for there to be plenty of proper commercial games. So let's look at some that push the limits, starting with Jeff Cramman's Aviator. A relatively early title from 1983, a couple of years after the system's 1981 launch, and perhaps the first game that came out on the BBC that really showed its potential beyond arcade-style games and educational software. There were other flight simulators around at the time on other machines, but, well, not that many actually at this point, and maybe very few that could match this sort of performance. Yes, it might look pretty monochrome and minimalist now, but it runs much more smoothly than Sublogic's flight simulator for the Apple II, for example. A big part of this can be explained by the BBC's relatively fast CPU. An MOS 6502, a solid 8-bit CPU, the same as in the Apple II and C64, but clocked at 2 whole megahertz, twice as fast as what was in either of those machines, more or less. This lets the screen be updated at, well, some frames per second, but it really isn't bad. The relative smoothness and lack of screen-tearing glitchiness is especially impressive when you consider the BBC's memory, or lack of it, and this game does do a clever trick to maximise how it uses it. 32 kilobytes puts it a long way ahead of some other machines on the market at the time, like the ZX81, but part of that memory has to be devoted to storing the graphics, which can eat up quite a lot. To get smooth 3D like this, you're going to need some sort of buffer, where the graphics for each frame can be composed first, which could take a while before all being revealed in one go. But when you've only got 32 kilobytes for the whole system, it's difficult to imagine where that buffer might fit. But this is the clever part. Although everything here is black and white, this is actually using one of the BBC's 4 colour modes, with 3 of the colours set to black. This means the graphics can be composed invisibly in black in the same memory as what is currently being displayed. Then, when they are ready, their colour can be instantly switched, revealing them, whilst the old graphics are switched back to black, making them disappear. This allows for a screen buffer to be used while still leaving enough memory for the rest of the game. Yes, whilst this does have some arcadey elements to it, it is quite a serious simulator really, and a tough one to play. Yeah, I'm afraid this isn't me playing the game in this footage. I had to admit defeat and use some footage from another YouTuber, Hoad, whose name will be cropping up again in this video, but for now, thanks Colin. But now let's scoot off and look at another Jeff Cramman game. It's Revs. Yes, from 1985, it's another simulator. Once again, not the first of its type, not the first game to call itself a racing simulator, but it might actually be the first to be able to back that claim up, at least on a home computer. Based on Formula 3000, actual racing driver David Hunt was brought in as a consultant to give it that extra kick of authenticity. Certainly realistic in the sense that if you put me in a real Formula 3000 car, I would struggle to even get it off the line, and if I did, I would immediately crash, just as what I do most of the time in this game. Yeah, it's hard to get anywhere in this, little of the hand-holding of modern games, though there is a steering aid on the deluxe 5-track version of this game. As well as keyboard controls, it does support analog input from the Beebs analog joystick, and that alone puts it ahead of most other similar games of the era. Yes, the graphics are a bit less minimalist than Aviator, but still fairly simple and direct. They are, though, fast and smooth once again, and well, pseudo 3D. You can actually turn around and go the wrong way in this game. They're also quite colourful, using 7 of the BBC's different shades in the main view, which suggests that this is running in graphics mode too. Yes, the BBC has a whole load of different graphics modes, taking up different amounts of memory, and the most colourful, Mode 2, gives all 8 colours and a resolution of 160 by 256, but it takes up 20 kilobytes of the 32 kilobyte memory. That really wouldn't leave much room for the rest of the game, and it certainly would be a struggle to fit in a buffer as well, which this game does need to use. But that's where Revs is very clever. Like Aviator, it has some screen trickery. This actually uses the same less memory-hungry 4-colour mode as Aviator, but swaps the colour palette out with different shades as the screen is drawn. You never have more than 4 different colours on a line, but more than that on the whole screen. There is more though. See this massive blue patch of sky? This actually stores game code, essential data, but as all 4 colours in the palette are set to the same blue, it just appears to be empty space. YouTuber Timberwolf has a great video explaining this in more detail, which I will definitely recommend if you want to know more. There will be a link in the description. You might also note that only a small section of the screen actually has any sort of animation in it, meaning you need a much smaller space for a buffer. But even so, there can't be that much memory free. But it turns out the space for this is found in a very clever way. When the game goes from the main menu to the main game, the graphics for the car dashboard need to be loaded in from the main memory to the screen. The space they leave behind is used as the frame buffer. You only need to store them in one place at once, so why not take advantage of that? In fact, this game's memory is sort of an intricate jigsaw puzzle, cleverly cramming in as much as possible. Mark Moxton's disassembly of this game on his website has all the details, which again I will link to in the description. Yes, you could load this from multiple parts from a disk. It would make it easier. You could have the menu loaded separately than the main game, but this is, like a lot of BBC games, designed to work from the lowest common denominator, the cassette, where you really need to keep loading to a minimum. And just to complete the trifecta of Jeff Crammond games on the BBC, here's his third and final one, which also loads all in one go from cassette. It's the Sentinel. There's not a good way to describe this game, how it works, what it is, what you're supposed to do. It's sort of a strategy puzzle game set in a series of surreal 3D landscapes. The aim is to gain height by warping from place to place till you're able to overlook the Sentinel and transport to its location, whereupon you beat the level and move on to the next one. There's 10,000 of these procedurally generated levels to get through, though beating them all was never supposed to be the goal. The aim was just, there's a lot. Yes, it's weird, it's otherworldly, and the actual nuance of the gameplay is a bit more complex than what I've told you. But the obvious, unusual thing about this is the 3D graphics. Some of the very first solid 3D polygons used in a game ever, certainly in a home system. Yeah, as you can probably tell, it doesn't really have a frame rate. The game takes place in a static landscape. You can't actually move in real time, you can just look around the scene, a bit like you're in a Google photosphere. It's incredible though just how different these graphics look from anything else from 1986 when this came out. The solid polygons giving a very early glimpse into what was to come in gaming's future. There's no texture on any of the surfaces, but there is some very simple lighting, polygons facing in one direction being white, the other being black. It works though and makes the landscape much easier to visually parse. I always assumed that when you start a level or shift positions, the entire landscape was rendered in one go as a single giant image that you scroll around in, like an actual Google photosphere, revealing more as you pan around. But now I don't think that's actually how it works though. Again, the BBC's memory would be the constraint. There's just not enough to fit an image several times the size of the screen in there. Instead, I think when the position of the player shifts, a 3D model of the landscape seen from that point is calculated, but only the bit you can see on the screen is rasterized, or turned into a 2D image that can be shown on a screen. When you pan around, a new view is rendered and the screen scrolls into the new view before deleting the old one. That's why it moves in big jumps. It looks like the engine uses a simple sort of ray tracing to calculate the viewpoint of the player, and then uses a sort of modified painter's algorithm to actually draw the scene. A cheat code reveals this a bit, leaving the rendering on instead of blanking the screen when you switch positions, and you can see the graphics being drawn, starting with the background, filling the various objects, and then finally the landscape polygons. This is such an odd game with such a unique atmosphere, and well, it's a far cry from nearly anything else in video game history. Maybe it's the BBC's association with education that gave it so many games that are a bit more cerebral. There were straight-up action arcade titles, definitely, but most of its best-loved, best-remembered games give the old thinking sponge a bit of a squeeze. Any suitably aged Brit will tell you that this was the computer in British schools all through the 80s and well into the 90s, and yeah, even its non-educational commercial game software library has quite a bit of my parents are teachers energy. This is the BBC after all. It's inform as well as entertain. It's Fred Harris, not Timmy Mallet. And this next game, well, it does nothing to disavow this brainy aura. Created by two students at Jesus College, Cambridge. It's the big one. It's Elite. Yes, this is the original, the main source, the beginning of the spacefaring game that gives you whole galaxies to explore. A classic that pioneered the open world and helped redefine what's possible in gaming. Anyone watching this video will probably know Elite, even if you've never played it. It's referenced so often as a touchstone in game design. It did it all, creatively brilliant programming genius that pulled gamers into an utterly engrossing deep space adventure. The wireframe 3D graphics are what caught people's attention initially, not just for show either. This is real 3D space you're operating in. Yes, it's flickery, there's no room in the memory for a screen buffer, but it is surprisingly fast after all these years. The BBC's speedy CPU helping out so much here, but that was really the only advantage this system could muster for this game. This that we're looking at now is the original cassette-based release that, fits the entire game into the BBC's 32 kilobytes. A mini-universe crammed into the tiniest of spaces. How did they do it? Well, there's not a lot of space left over in the memory. Alexander the OK has a fascinating and in-depth video about BBC Elite which I would recommend watching, but there's a lot of clever stuff going on. Elite of course ended up on a lot of other systems, many of them with fewer constraints than the BBC, and spawned a franchise that's still with us today. But beyond that, its influence spreads directly and indirectly to many, many other games. EVE Online, No Man's Sky, yes, but not just space sims. Anything open world owes a debt to this for bringing the idea forward. This game's enormous popularity led to multiple versions, even on the BBC. A bit of a confusing number in fact, but this here is the second processor version. Yes, the very expandable BBC had quite a few options for adding extra processing power, and most of the time games really weren't the aim. But this version, officially released in 1985, shows off what that extra processing power can do. A smoother, more colourful experience and less flickery too. Still not easy to duck though, and well, the actual extra processor here is another 6502, and it has a load of extra memory as well, kind of like two BBCs strapped together. But well, to move on, there is one more big pioneering game that begins with E on the BBC. Yes, it's Exile. An action game, absolutely, but keeping with the BBC style, it's not just about mindless blasting. This is the thinking man's run and gun game. One with a lot of complexities and yes, another early open world. Space dude marooned on a hostile alien planet is the basic thrust of the plot, a fairly familiar tale, yes. You could make an easy comparison to Nintendo's Metroid, of course, but I doubt there was any direct influence. Both games came out the same year in the UK, and whilst Metroid has a sort of lock and key type of game flow, Exile is more like a super old school Breath of the Wild with more room for improvisation. And yes, this game is long and it's hard, so much so I'm going to cheat once again. Yes, this is more footage gratefully borrowed from fellow YouTuber Colin Hoad. His channel is fantastic, by the way, bags of stuff about the BBC Micro, so I would highly recommend taking a look. Probably the best in-depth coverage of BBC games on YouTube. There is a link in the description to his YouTube and his website. But what this helps us see is the wonderful emergent behaviour of all the game's systems. Individually it might all be pretty simple, but the basic physics simulation, the enemy AI makes for a very dynamic world when it all works together. Colin here wrestling with a flask of water gives a good glimpse of the craziness that can happen.
And the problem is, can you see the water keeps getting knocked out by the bird each time I fly up? Because I knock the flask on the bird, and it knocks all the water out of my flask. Oh dear, you would think that you could go far enough down into the water and it would drown the bird, but no, the bird is tenacious. The bird is tenacious.
This is a game that's about the world you're in and your interactions with it, not just following set paths. And again, yes, this all fits into a baffling 32 kilobytes, though I must say if you have a memory expansion or one of the later BBC machines with more memory, you can enjoy some more features, like a larger visible screen area and sampled sound, though not all that much. You might have noticed that all the games I've featured here have been pretty sparse on the sound, which might seem strange when you consider the BBC's sound capabilities. It had the same sound chip as the Sega Master System and Game Gear, so it is quite capable of pretty good classic 8-bit type chip music, but hardly any games seem to bother that much with sound. I think possibly memory constraints might have played a part once again. So now it's probably time to start wending towards a conclusion, but when I started this video I really thought I might struggle to find enough uniquely interesting BBC games to talk about, but actually no, I'm buried in them. There's so many more I could mention. The Repton series, Striker, more games than I can fit into this video. But there is though a couple of notable things about the BBC library. Firstly, it really missed out on a lot of the big cross-platform games of the era, no matter what the genre, and also the software scene dried up much more quickly. By 1990, other 8-bit systems were still getting hundreds of releases in many cases, but the BBC was seeing just a handful. Why is that? Well, market forces, really. To people from outside the UK, or maybe younger people, the BBC Micro might seem like some sort of socialist people's computer used throughout the land by government diktat, but it really wasn't like that. The BBC was sold alongside, competing with, every other machine from Commodore, Sinclair, IBM, whoever. Schools weren't forced to buy them, but it did make perfect sense for what they needed. But so much of what appealed to schools didn't appeal to the home user, and the stuff that did, well, you could get all that and more, frankly, cheaper elsewhere. The 32K BBC Micro was £399 just for the machine, close to double to what you would pay for a Commodore 64. Acorn's answer was the Acorn Electron, a cost-reduced BBC minus the branding, but well, that is another story. Ultimately, the BBC Micro went out of production by 1994, but it had stopped being much of a player in the home market much earlier than that. Of course, though, that's not the end. Fans have kept the dream alive. Yeah, modern releases often take old systems to wonderful new places, and this is Stunt Car Racer, developed by BitShifters and released in 2019. A particularly appropriate conversion because, yes, the original was created by none other than Jeff Crammond. He went on to develop some very notable racing games after Revs, this being one of them. This release, though, brings it back home to the BBC, and wow, it really is stunningly smooth and fluid. Yeah, again, the fast CPU helps, but also, this version is for the 128K BBC Master only. The memory constraints not quite so constraining here. Yeah, this release is as good on the BBC as it was anywhere, and it was officially ported to many systems, including 8-bit ones. Just goes to show what the BBC family missed out on by having maybe a curtailed life. And far from the only modern game worth looking at, because from the same team, it's Prince of Persia. Another oddly appropriate game because it was the Apple II where this began the go-to education computer in the USA, or so I understand. The colour scheme is, well, it's better than the PC CGA version, but it is a little bit garish. Though otherwise, wow, this really does look so good. I'm really amazed at what a great version of the game this is. Again, it requires the 128K BBC Master, but really the only significant difference that machine offered was more RAM. Same CPU, basically same graphics and sound capabilities. But if we really want to push things, then well, we can go for this. Elite, the new kind, released in 2021 by James Watson of Dudley Soft. If you think this looks suspiciously advanced, well, yeah, this is because this requires the Pi Tube add-on, adding the processing power of a Raspberry Pi. A port of the PC remake of Elite, running on the ARM processor of the Pi, interfaced with the BBC. Cheating, surely you might say, ARM processors on this old beast, but again, this is strangely appropriate. You see, the successor to the BBC Micro was the Archimedes. Not an earth-shattering success itself, but the special processor designed for it by Acorn absolutely was. Yes, it was Acorn that developed what became called the ARM processor line on a BBC Micro, and its first use was as an add-on for the BBC. Eventually, development was taken over by a subsidiary of Acorn, ARM Holdings, who, helped by funding from Apple, went on to, well, yeah, total domination in the mobile device world. Elite isn't the only game to take advantage of the Pi Tube thing, but well, I think the end is here for this video. That is, well, that's the BBC Micro, a computer by and for people who don't own chip pans, and one with a deserved place in history. Whenever you see any sort of retrospective of the system, it's impact in education is what seems to be talked about the most. People learning BBC Basic or learning to use a keyboard with educational games or whatever. Its role in bringing computers to a generation of kids. But honestly, its part in the ARM architecture and its influence on games might be a bigger deal in the long term. So that is that. Thank you to my patrons. Thank you once again. It really does help me out. If you would like to join them, there is a link below. And I will say thank you so much for watching and goodbye.